Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Busaith. I use she and her pronouns. I am one of the trainers at SAFE or the SAFE Alliance, and I'll be guiding you through this presentation. Now, normally I like to make this really interactive, but I also know that flexibility is super important right now. So feel free to go through at your own pace. The whole lecture should take about 1 hour to complete, including videos. Now, because I'll be talking about violence and abuse, I know that this can weigh heavily for folks. So I want you to think about the space that you're in, make sure that you're comfortable, and I want you to think about how you'll be taking care of yourself before, during, and after going through the material. I always enjoy this guest lecture as an opportunity to meet and connect with future nurses, so I've included my contact info. Please feel free to use that if anyone has questions, wants to know more about our services, wants to volunteer. Do not hesitate to reach out to me. Now we'll be talking about our services at SAFE in just a moment on the next few slides. But one request that I get pretty often is to connect with our forensic nurses to learn more about their role or to learn about the process of becoming a sexual assault nurse examiner or SANE. And they love hearing from y'all. So you are more than welcome to reach out to me if you'd like to connect with someone from that program as well. So I wanted to first introduce SAFE, as they can be an incredible resource if you're working locally or if you plan to work locally, but also share information at the end of the presentation for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So if you find yourself working in another area, they can connect you or your patient with the agency nearest you. So SAFE stands for Stop Abuse for Everyone. We're also known as the SAFE Alliance. We are a merger of Austin Children's Shelter and Safe Place. So many clinics still refer to us as Safe Place, which is totally fine. Just know that we are now one agency still providing the same services that we have for decades. So we are able to help folks who've experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, trafficking, and child abuse. And all of our services are confidential and absolutely free. And I'll talk about some of those services in just a moment. Now, I mentioned our merger. This was informed by recommendations from the CDC to integrate trauma-focused agencies. The same way in the healthcare field, you're talking a lot about integrated healthcare. It's kind of the same thing because we know that one form of violence increases the risk of other forms of violence. So in a lot of areas in the country, these different forms of violence are served by different agencies. And we see this a lot where different needs are being put into these professional silos, which breaks down communication between systems. But in many cases, it can also lead to re-traumatization by having to tell your story over and over again to a handful of strangers just to get the services that you need. So it's SAFE. We're able to minimize that harm and bridge communication between systems by providing as much services in-house as possible. So I'll talk briefly about what some of those services look like. Probably the most important thing for you to know and remember is our 24-hour SAFE line. That is going to be the main point of contact for most of our services. And folks can they can access the SAFE line by phone, text, or chat, whatever is most accessible and most safe to them in that moment. So some of the main reasons that someone might call the SAFE line, probably the biggest one is safety planning. So that might be connecting with emergency shelter if there's space available. It could be providing one-time assistance to access a safe place. So there have been times where maybe somebody has a place to stay with a friend or a family member, but it's out of state and they just need help getting that plane ticket or getting that Greyhound bus ticket to get to that safe place. Sometimes we can help with that as well. And safety planning also can just look like that in the moment problem solving. So if you find yourself working with a patient and you feel like, oh, I need to troubleshoot some of this with an advocate, regardless of the time of day, you can work with your patient, either connect them with the SAFE line or you can call the SAFE line yourself, and they can help you with that in the moment problem solving. We can also connect folks with free confidential counseling that could be individual or group counseling, legal assistance. So that could be helping someone with divorce or custody issues, questions around immigration law, protective orders, working with landlords, or just connecting folks with other free or low-cost legal services if they need more ongoing representation. Another program that is super unique to SAFE is our 24-hour sexual assault clinic. So we have a 24-hour rotation of on-call nurses and advocates. They can meet a survivor either in the hospital, in the emergency room, or at our on-site clinic called Eloise House. Here we can provide medical and legal options in the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault. That can look like giving emergency contraception, STI prophylaxis, connecting folks with PEP for HIV prevention, treating injuries, or giving folks some options around evidence collection. That part of it, the evidence collection, does not necessarily require a police report, and it is 100% optional. And we can help connect folks with other resources as well at our on-site clinic. We can provide advocacy, so that might be helping remove whatever barriers there are that's preventing someone from leaving an abusive situation or getting to a safe place. So that could be financial assistance, helping someone get a job, helping someone finish their education, getting folks bus passes, or just doing that ongoing case management. And we can also provide support for parents. Sometimes parents are sharing custody of their kids, but maybe there's a protective order that prevents them from contacting each other, and that can make it really complicated. So we can help navigate that as well. Sometimes a victim themselves, they're able to get out of an unsafe situation and bring their kids with them, but now they're navigating CPS involvement. And so we can help them navigate that system and help keep their family safe and together. So with all of these services, we do our best to provide quality services for everyone, regardless of who is calling or walking through our doors. So that means our services are not just for women. A lot of times we are only talking about female survivors, but folks of all gender identities experience violence. So we have support groups for male survivors. Our shelter accepts folks of all genders, and we do everything that we can to affirm trans survivors as well. We have advocates who are fluent in English, Spanish, and American Sign Language, and we can connect with translation services for other languages when it's needed. Now, before we really dive into the content, I want to start with a little bit of a self-reflection. Now, when I do this training in person, I usually start with this first question. I will ask the group, why might someone stay in an abusive relationship? And the reason I ask that is that may be the question that you're asking yourself when you're in front of that patient. So I want you to think about it for a second. Why might someone stay with the person that's harming them? Now, a lot of times when we have this discussion, folks will immediately think of the barriers, right? We'll talk about fear, isolation, credible threats to their safety, lack of options, lack of resources like housing or money. Now, all of those are valid reasons, and they definitely play a role, but it's not 100% of the picture. What we often don't talk about and we don't think about are these other factors, the factors that keep us in any relationship. Things like love, hope, attachment, shared history, family. So that brings us to the second question. How can we better empathize with a patient who's experiencing abuse? So I want us to start by thinking about our own relationships in our life. So I want you to think of a significant relationship. It could be a current partner, a former partner, a friend, a family member. And I'm going to ask you to think of specific scenarios, when that scenario may have applied to you and what it felt like. So think of a time that you lost a close relationship or you had to sever a close relationship and what that was like. Now I want you to think of a time that you found it hard to express how you're feeling because you were afraid of how the other person would react. Now think of a time that you put the needs or the wants of someone close to you ahead of your own. And if you're anything like me and you're a people pleaser or you just want to help others, that may have been pretty often. And finally, I want you to think of a relationship that you've held on to even after you felt that it was no longer working for you, either because you didn't want to be alone or you were hoping that that person would change. Now, I think that these are situations that a lot of us can relate to. I can definitely relate to each one of these situations. And these are going to be the ways that we can empathize with the person in front of us. Because I think all of us have been in a relationship or a friendship that we've held on to, even if it wasn't healthy for us. And we know that severing those relationships is hard under any circumstance. But it becomes even harder once trauma is involved. It's still a loss. So if we're working with a patient who is clearly being harmed by their partner, by a family member, or by their parent, and they're not very forthcoming with us, and they're trying to protect the person harming them, and we're just wondering why, we just can't understand it, and we feel like we need to convince them. We can pause, and we can start from a place of empathy. We can offer them options, offer them information. We can express that we're concerned for their safety without trying to convince them that they're a victim or trying to convince them that their loved one is an abuser. That's not what's important. What's important in that moment is protecting that relationship with our patient so that they still trust us, and just refocusing on their safety and planning around their safety. I'm going to start by talking about the dynamics of domestic violence, the intersection of domestic violence and child abuse, because many times both can occur at the same time. How to report, and then what are some of the tactics that an abusive partner or an abusive family member might use, so that you have a better idea of what it looks like so that you can better recognize and better respond to a suspicion of abuse. We're also going to talk about the barriers, not just the barriers to leaving, but also the barriers to reporting, because those dynamics are going to be at play when you're working with a patient and they're still deciding what they are willing to share and what feels safe enough to share. And then we're going to talk about the response, about working with survivors. Now, your setting may have screening tools already in place, but if you have any flexibility with what questions you ask and how you ask them, Stanford University School of Medicine has issued some guidelines on best practices for screening, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, if someone has already made the vulnerable choice to entrust you with the information that they're being abused, what do you do with that? Some of that response is also looking at our own emotional response, and avoiding some of the common pitfalls so that we respond in a way that's trauma-informed and that protects that trusting relationship with the patient. Now, when we're talking about child maltreatment, usually we're talking about one of four things: neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Now, the majority of the time, with the exception of physical abuse and some instances of sexual abuse, most of the time you're not going to see observable physical signs of abuse. So in those other instances, it's important to know what the other warning signs are. These warning signs might include a delay in seeking treatment for injuries, any sort of inconsistencies in the story, or insisting on speaking for the child. Now, as you can see from these statistics from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, by far the most common form of child abuse is neglect. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that can look like. Now, because neglect is the most common form of child abuse, I think it's important to define it and name a few examples of what it can look like. So neglect is defined as failing to provide for a child's basic needs. So that could be failing to meet their physical needs, their medical needs, their educational needs, or failing to meet their emotional needs or their needs for appropriate supervision. Now, if you look at the statistics that we provided on the right of the ages that are at most risk, you'll notice a trend. The younger the child, the higher the risk. In fact, if you combine all of the ages under the age of 5, they make up the majority of neglect cases. Now, I usually ask, why do you think that might be? Why do you think that children under 5 make up the majority of neglect cases? Usually what I hear is that young children are already more vulnerable, right? They're less able to speak for themselves. Children of this age are a lot smaller. They're physically more vulnerable. But also their worlds are a lot smaller. A child who has not attended school yet has fewer outside adults and fewer opportunities for someone to notice what's going on. So isolation is a huge risk factor for child survivors and adult survivors of abuse. So as a healthcare provider, it could be possible that your interaction with them is one of the only opportunities for someone to notice what's going on and to intervene to ensure their safety. Now, there are going to be mandated reporting requirements for our licenses, for our job roles, but even something that's interesting about Texas is that everybody in the state of Texas, regardless of their job role and regardless of the setting, everybody in Texas is a mandated reporter. Now, a mandated reporter is defined as a person having cause to believe that a child's physical or mental health or welfare has been adversely affected by abuse or neglect. Now, of course, we're not just mandated reporters for minors under the age of 18, but also for adults over the age of 65 and anyone with a severe disability. Now, that's where there can be kind of gray areas. Usually we think of this as someone who cannot complete the activities of daily living without assistance. Now, in these cases, if we are making a report of abuse, we're not documenting opinions. We are just documenting the observable facts. What did you see? Think about the physical findings and observable behaviors. What questions did you ask and what were the responses? Now, the priority in these situations will be to interview the patient alone in whatever way that's possible. Whether that's a child that you suspect may be abused, or an adult with a disability, or someone over the age of 65 that may be harmed by a family member or a caregiver. Otherwise, not only are you less likely to get accurate information, but it might actually be unsafe for that patient to disclose what's happening to them if the abusive party is also with them at the clinic or at the hospital. Another thing to consider is informing your patient of your role as a mandated reporter and explaining what that means can help establish trust and keep trust with them so that nothing comes as a surprise. You may also have family members there who are not the abusive party, for example, a parent who is also a victim themselves and they have no power to stop the abuse. You can involve them in that conversation. If you know that you have to make a call either way, you can tell this family member or tell that parent what it is that you need to do, why you need to do it. Maybe you can involve them in that conversation or empower them to make that call themselves. Now, of course, there are going to be times when you just don't have all the information, but you do have cause to believe. That is the threshold there. Now, it's important to remember you are immune from liability for reporting. So you're not going to be sued if your suspicion was unfounded, but you may be legally accountable for not reporting those cases. So just remember, it is not your duty to investigate. It's okay if you don't have all the information. It is just your duty to relay information. There are going to be professionals on the other end of that hotline, and that is their only job. Their job is to investigate. You don't have to investigate whether abuse is occurring. If you just have cause to believe, then it is your duty to just relay those observable facts. Now, there's one more thing, since we're talking about mandated reporting, that I really want to make clear. If there is a case of violence, and that person is not a minor, they're not over the age of 65, they're not an individual with a disability, we are not mandated to report that to the police. So we're talking about abusive relationships, or maybe you suspect human trafficking, sex trafficking. Even if we know that they're going home to a dangerous situation, or we know that when they walk out your doors that they're going back on the streets and they're going to be in physical danger, we need to recognize that they are the experts in their safety. And it's not only more ethical, but it may also be more safe for them physically to just give them the information, give them options, and empower them to decide what's next, because there may be unintended consequences of involving the police that we are not aware of. Now, as we shift to situations where we suspect that someone is being abused, but they are not a minor, they're not over 65, and they're not an individual with a severe disability, and you think this may be domestic violence, I want us to stop for a moment and actually look at that phrase, because this is a phrase that we use a lot in the field, but it's not going to be very accessible to the people that we're working with. And it can also give off the wrong impression, right? When we hear the phrase domestic violence, I think it's natural for our minds to immediately jump to physical violence because of the word violence in there, right? We are immediately thinking of observable physical injuries, but domestic violence, we're using a broader term of violence as a pattern of behavior used to establish power and control over another person. And physical violence is only one tool in that person's toolbox, right? They may be using fear, they may be using intimidation, isolation, humiliation, or even just the threat of violence. So all of those different tactics can be used to establish power and control over another person, and that is still abuse. And the actual use of physical violence may occur infrequently. It may only occur every once in a while, or it may not occur at all. But all of these other tactics still have the same impact as physical violence because they are controlling that person and limiting their options. And in that sense, they are still unsafe, and it can still have an impact on their health. So I want to reiterate that any form of abuse can be thought of as a use of power to maintain control. And sometimes that's not always violent. So many times we use this wheel, it's called the power and control wheel, to demonstrate and help someone identify what behaviors they're experiencing, even if they're not comfortable with the label of domestic violence. So in this model, power and control are central. That is the main goal of the abusive partner or family member. And the common tactics that maintain and support that power and control you can think of as spokes of a wheel, because they are what support everything. That is the day-to-day reality. Those are the behaviors that someone is experiencing every day. And the extremes, like physical violence and sexual violence, they just reinforce everything. They're right on the outside of the wheel, gluing everything together, but that may not necessarily be the day-to-day reality. Because if you think about it, if someone has complete control over another person, they may not necessarily need to use physical violence. They're only going to use it when they feel that they're losing control. So we also talk about using privilege. Now, a lot of times we think of privilege as the differences in power, and we're usually just focused on gender dynamics, right? The power of a man over a woman, or we're focusing on differences in body size and strength, right? Still just focusing in on physical violence. But there are a lot of other differences in power between two people that someone could leverage. So that could be using homophobia or using transphobia in a relationship. If one person is out and the other person is not, the abusive partner may use that to their advantage and say, hey, if you leave me, I'm going to tell your family that you're gay. And they're not going to accept you. They're not going to take you in. Or I'll tell your employer that you're trans and then you're going to lose your job, right? So that's a difference in power, and someone is leveraging that to control the other person. So there may also be differences in immigration status, differences in language access, right? If only one person is fluent in English, or they have more access to resources, more social influence. Maybe they don't have a criminal history, but the other person does. Or using a disability, access to health insurance, or a substance use problem to reinforce a dependency on their partner. So some other examples that we see of controlling someone without necessarily leaving a mark, maybe threatening violence, right? Throwing things, blackmailing them, belittling them, sabotaging their work. And we think of that as economic abuse, not allowing them to work or only giving them an allowance. Now, there are two that I really want to emphasize with you, and that's isolation. Now, there are a lot of ways that someone might be isolated. Maybe their movement's restricted. They're only allowed to be at home. They're not allowed to leave. Maybe it's frequent moving from state to state. Or if they are allowed to leave, maybe it's controlling where they go, who they see, who they talk to, and maybe all their conversations have to be closely monitored. Now, there's a good reason that abusive partners or family members will use this, right? It makes the other person more dependent. It gives them fewer options. There are less people involved in their life that can notice what's happening. So the more isolated someone is, the more at risk they are. And we talked about this when we were talking about neglect, right? Children under 5, those over the age of 65, people with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities, they have smaller worlds. Especially if you think someone with a language barrier, right? If the world is smaller to them, then they have fewer contact with outsiders, and that's what makes their contact with you such an important opportunity to reach out to someone, because it may be their only chance. Now, I also want to think about all of the ways that the abuse is minimized, denied, or blamed on the victim. Right? I wouldn't be like this if you just did what I asked, or I only get jealous because I love you so much, or just labeling things as tough love. This is what can make it so hard to identify abuse, because that patient themselves will likely minimize the abuse, or they'll blame it on themselves. So we want to make sure that we're not forcing the label of victim or abuser or domestic violence. Now, these are some of the lethality risks that we in the domestic violence field look out for that really increase the chances of intentional or accidental death. Now, these are the risk factors that we use in our assessments in cases when maybe someone is trying to access emergency shelter, but we have a waiting list. So sometimes we have to triage survivors. These are going to be some of the lethality risks that we're looking for. Now, probably the most relevant to you are going to be these last two. Now, when we talk about strangulation, that's going to be a term that the general public is not going to use. People are more likely to use the word choking, even though it is technically inaccurate. That's usually more likely what we're going to hear from people. So if we hear that, we really want to clarify that they mean that somebody put their hands around their neck and restricted their breathing. Now, our forensic nurses at Eloise House, they always screen for strangulation, not only because it increases the risk of homicide by 700%, but also because there are important time-sensitive evaluations that are recommended, such as a CT angio. We just don't have that equipment. So usually in those cases, we refer to a nearby hospital. I would definitely recommend that you check out these recommendations. There's a link, a little blue link, you can follow that. And that will outline some of the medical recommendations, as well as the signs to look out for. That same website, they also have a Dear Doctor letter. If there is a situation where you know that there's strangulation and you know that there are these medical recommendations, and maybe you just need to show the references, you just need to show the research. We also have a Dear Doctor letter that sometimes our advocates may provide to a doctor and that nurses can provide to a doctor as well if you ever feel that you need to advocate for a patient. Now, one thing I want to point out about strangulation cases that kind of illustrates not just what to ask, but how you ask it and how that can make a difference has to do with our clinic at Eloise House. In recent years, we've actually seen an increase in the percentage of strangulation referrals. And now we looked at those numbers and we thought this probably isn't because more strangulations are occurring in the community. It more likely has to do with a change in how we're asking. Now, around the time that we saw an increase in strangulation referrals, we'd also changed the way that we were asking about strangulation. And the way that nurses now ask is instead of asking directly about strangulation, they're focusing on the effects. What is it that we want to know? And really what's most important is a lack of oxygen, a loss of oxygen to the brain. So we just ask, was there any point during this encounter where you couldn't breathe? And someone may be more likely to say yes to that, even if they're uncomfortable right off the bat saying yes to strangulation or saying yes to having hands around their throat. So we just want to ask, was there any point where you couldn't breathe? And if they say yes to that, you want to ask, for how long? About how long do you think you were having trouble breathing? And that's going to be what's most important. Now, finally, I want to point out this last lethality risk that sometimes comes up because it's probably the most important, but it's also the least intuitive, and it really challenges our assumptions of safety. And that's knowing that people are at the highest risk of homicide when they have left the relationship or when they're in the process of leaving. We actually see that when we're looking at domestic violence homicides. More than half of those cases, the person was already estranged from their partner. And that really challenges this sort of common assumption that we just need to convince this person to leave. And once they've left, then they're automatically more safe. Now, usually after they've left, that's when we really need to start safety planning and adjusting our safety planning and really monitoring the situation. So if we know that someone is being abused and they're not quite ready to leave yet, we don't want to push them to leave. We want to recognize that they are experts in their own safety, and there may be some other things that they need to take into consideration, or some other things that they need to get in place before they're ready to leave. And we're just going to follow their lead there and focus on safety. Now, I mentioned this in the last slide, but any time that we are working with a patient who is in an unsafe situation, we also need to look at and maybe challenge our own assumptions of safety and what that looks like. Now, at the end, we'll be talking about the difference between a rescuing approach and an empowering approach. And two of the most common pitfalls I see of a rescuing approach is trying to convince that person to leave, even though we know that may actually be when they're in the most danger, or just convincing them to call the police. Even though we may not be aware of the barriers to calling the police. Even worse, I've heard of cases when someone just calls the police themselves without involving the patient. Now, they had good intentions, but in that moment, they took power away from that patient, and they may not have been aware of the unintended consequences of involving the police. So I want to talk about what some of those unintended consequences are so that you can really understand the fear in the room in that moment. Now we know that calling the police is going to escalate a situation, right? It is usually a last resort, and it's gambling with someone's safety because we know that there is no guarantee of an arrest. And if that person isn't arrested, well, now they know that outsiders are meddling in their situation, and they're more likely to become even more violent towards the victim. Now, there's always going to be fear of losing children as well, and that is a valid fear. There's always a risk of CPS involvement. There's also a risk of the non-offending parent, right? The person who may be a victim themselves, they could also be charged criminally charged with failure to protect the child. And that's another reason why, if you have to make a CPS report, really involving them in that process and allowing their voice, allowing their side of the story in that call so that they can detail all the ways that they have tried to protect their child, that can really go a long way down the road. There are a lot of instances too where that person may have a fear of getting arrested themselves. We don't know if they have warrants for any minor offenses. We also don't know if they've been forced by their partner to do something illegal. And that's a very, very common tactic to really entrap their victim, so that calling the police is suddenly not an option. And finally, there may be reasons why involving the police just isn't a safe option for that person because they're part of a community that has been harmed by the police in the past. So I'm talking about people of color, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or queer, folks who are experiencing poverty or homelessness, or folks that are undocumented. Now, none of this is to say that the police don't play a role or they can't play a role in ensuring someone's safety. They can be a crucial resource if and when the survivor wants it and consents to it. We also need to recognize the reality of the patient that we're working with. We need to validate their fears and follow their lead when it comes to their safety, rather than trying to push our own agenda based on our assumption of safety.
It is the question that I'm asked the most. Why did I stay? Why does any woman stay? And for the life of me, I can't understand why people are obsessed with it, because to me, it's so obvious. Why does anybody stay with somebody that they love? You know, we've all been in relationships that, even if they weren't abusive, we're not working any longer, and we all stay far longer than we want. And you stay for the same reasons. You stay because you love the person, or you love what you used to have, or you're trying to take care of your children.
When we ask, why did you stay, we're blaming the victim for their abuse, as opposed to asking, why did you hit this person? Or why are you violent? Or why do you feel the need to be violent?
Why would somebody abuse? Why would somebody beat the people who love him or her most on earth? Until we ask that question, we won't be able to obliterate domestic violence. We have got to focus on the perpetrators of violence, not the victims.
It's cliche, but he really was Prince Charming. He was very kind and sweet and nice. I left what I was doing to come and be with him, and I was alone with him. I didn't have any friends or family in the area. I couldn't find a job, so he paid the bills. And so we got into an argument, and that's the first time that he hit me. He actually threw me up against the wall and started to choke me. And I didn't really understand what was happening because he was not that person all this time. And so when he finally let me go, I thought it was something I did. I wasn't thinking to run. After we got married, it didn't stop. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I felt like I was trapped. At that point, we had moved from where we were across the country again, and I was further isolated. I didn't have any friends or family, and essentially he still was the breadwinner. I was dependent on him. So if I left, what was I gonna do? Where was I gonna go? How was I gonna take care of myself? I felt like no one would understand, and I felt like no one would care.
The first full-out physical attack was 5 days before the wedding. Part of me knew I had to leave him right then, that I couldn't marry somebody who had done this. But then this other part of me said, but wait, it was one time. And I told myself he'd never do it again, that I was sure he was very sorry, and I didn't leave. I married him.
You stayed with this guy.
Yeah, I didn't have a choice.
I mean, he told me, and I absolutely, you know, that's the part that it always, it's so interesting to me when it's like, you know, the standard question, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? Well, he was trained by the United States Marine Corps to hunt people down and kill them, and he told me if I left, he would hunt me down and kill me. That's why I didn't leave. I used to pull what he would call my disappearing acts, and that would be, I would, you know, get the boys and get out because it just was getting too intense. But I would always go back because at least I knew where he was. At least I knew the routine. I knew what to expect. But, you know, it's a terrible way to live, to always be looking over your shoulder. He didn't start out with being abusive. He started out with being incredibly sweet and incredibly attentive and incredibly thoughtful and incredibly kind and saying things to me that no one had ever said and paying attention to me in ways that no one ever had. You know, and I was really taken by it.
One of the reasons why we stay is because the behavior is such a drastic change from the person we met in the beginning. And we're constantly looking for the man in the beginning instead of concentrating on the man that is in front of us. Once I understood that, then I made the decision, you know, I gotta go. This is not the same man I married. I mean, I love him, but he's gonna kill me.
With every violent moment, I felt further connected to him in this kind of twisted way. I felt that, you know, we had this secret that bound us together and that this was something big and we were working on it. And so we had to stay together until we worked it out. The violence got to a point where I realized that I could die. I had to create a plan. I had to figure out where I was gonna go and how I was gonna get there and who I was gonna reach out to for help if there was any. I was scared. I was afraid that he would find me. I was afraid that he would be so angry that I left, that he would come after me. I couldn't just get up and walk away.
And it was the most terrible feeling to know that I could leave and I still couldn't leave because I was bound by this psychological trap that I thought was love, that wasn't love. You know, I had so much denial. If you had come to me and said, are you being physically abused? You know, if my doctor had asked me or a best friend, I would have said, no, I'm not being physically abused.
You do feel isolated and you keep a lot of secrets. You know, you keep a lot of secrets in your heart, in your home, in your head. I stayed because I believed him when he said he wasn't gonna do it again. I stayed because I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have any money. I didn't have access to any resources. I stayed because my religious community convinced me that I couldn't get divorced because God would hate me. I stayed because I loved him. You know, I stayed because he was the love of my life, and I wanted to believe that love could conquer all, including abuse.
So what's the connection? Why is this relevant to your role? Now, hopefully by this point you've already seen the connection and you can see how this can relate to your day-to-day job. But sometimes I provide this training for clinics that have just started a new universal screening tool where now they're screening all of their patients in a private space for domestic violence. and they want to do role plays. They want to talk it through. And usually for those trainings, I'll start with this question. What is the connection? Why are you even being trained in this? Because before you can become comfortable with talking with patients about their safety, with talking with them about their home life, about their relationships, you need to first understand why it's even relevant to your role. So when I do ask this question, probably my favorite response that I've gotten was from a community clinic. And one of the staff said, people come here because they trust us. And I think no matter what kind of healthcare provider you are, that's what people see in you. They know this is a person who I can talk to about my safety, who's going to care about my safety. This is a person that I can have a private, confidential conversation with. And you may actually be the only person in their life that they can have a private, confidential conversation with, because HIPAA empowers you to provide them with that privacy. You can also use that to your advantage to ensure their safety as well. Now, everything that we've talked about so far, the dynamics of abuse, the barriers to leaving, the barriers to reporting, these are all going to be dynamics in the room when you are with a patient and they're deciding how much they're comfortable with sharing with you. Now, there's a quote from the video that we just watched that really stood out to me. If someone asked me, "Are you being abused?" I would have said, "No, I'm not being abused." And I think this is a prime example of the importance of not just what you ask, but how you ask it, and how we can be strategic about what you're asking. So for example, if you ask someone if they're experiencing domestic violence, they're probably going to say no, because that's not first and foremost how they define their relationship. We can instead ask about specific behaviors. If you ask someone, "Are you a victim?" they're probably going to say no, because they don't recognize themselves as a victim. They're willingly a part of that relationship. And if the person that we, in our minds, label as their abuser is also someone that they love, that they share a home with, they share family with, they're not going to feel comfortable with internalizing those labels of victim and abuser and domestic violence, because that's not how they define their reality. That's how we define it in the field. But we don't want to be forcing those labels on someone. So we really want to be strategic in how we ask these questions. Now, depending on the setting, you may have your own screening tools. You may not have a lot of flexibility in how you ask those questions, but if you do have some flexibility, for example, I've worked with staff at Planned Parenthood with their screening tool and their screening questions, and I've kind of workshopped with them. What are some ways that you can rephrase these questions where you might be more likely to get an accurate and honest answer? Because you really want to just be thinking about what is most relevant to this person's health needs and the care that I'm providing for them. Another example that I shared is our forensic nurses at Eloise House. When they want to do a strangulation assessment, they want to screen for that. They're not just going to ask, "Were you ever strangled?" They're going to ask, "Is there any point that you weren't able to breathe? And if so, for how long?" Because that's what's most relevant to their assessment. That's what's most relevant to the care that they're going to provide and the recommendations that they're going to make. And I think aside from that, it's also a lot easier for someone to answer that question than probably a more strongly worded question. So there are a couple things to consider in how we can be strategic. And these three guidelines were outlined by the Stanford University School of Medicine. They talk about framing the question, asking things indirectly, and then when we need to, asking those more direct questions. So when we're framing the question, we're really just explaining what we're asking and why we're asking it. And that's helpful, especially if we're going to be asking questions that normally aren't asked in a routine health appointment. I think people are going to expect maybe some invasive or uncomfortable questions about their body or about their health history or even their sexual history. But if we're asking somebody about their home life or about their relationships, that may catch them a little off guard. So we want to first frame this as normal, frame it as a routine part of their appointment, and explain why this can be relevant to their health, and really reframe it just as we just want to make sure that everyone is safe, and we know that sometimes people aren't comfortable with sharing this information, so we just ask everybody. Then when we are asking questions, we can either ask them directly or indirectly. Now, an indirect question is going to be one of those open-ended questions instead of a yes or no question, like, how are things at home? How would you describe your relationship with your parents? These are going to be questions that allow a little bit more freedom to disclose only with what that person is comfortable with. And then if we ever need to do a follow-up question, we need more specific, more accurate information, that's when we can follow up with those direct yes or no questions. Now in the next 3 slides, you're just going to go through and there are going to be some examples of what those questions can look like. Now, anytime that we're screening for violence and abuse, we need to be prepared for the possibility of a yes. So if someone is going to disclose to me that they're experiencing abuse, I need to be emotionally prepared for that. And I want to think ahead of time of how I'm going to respond. Now, there are 3 things to keep in mind. We want to focus on safety and privacy. We want to make sure that we are empowering that person rather than unintentionally trying to rescue them. And we want to validate their experience. And we'll watch a video in just a moment on what we mean by validating their experience. Now, there are a few questions that we can ask that really reframe safety as a priority. So a few examples might be, if you decided you wanted to leave your home for your safety or your children's safety, what are your options? Where could you go? Now, again, we're saying if you decided, we're not pushing them towards anything. We could ask them, are there things that you've tried in the past when the violence has gotten really bad that kept you and your children safe? Does calling the police feel like a safe option for you, right? We're not just assuming that. We can ask someone where they feel safe or who they feel safe with. The same way that we would have discharge instructions or some sort of care plan, we want to identify someone that they can reach out to immediately, because your role with them is so limited, right? It's time limited. You can't follow up with them. So you want to help them identify some options, some people that they can reach out to, whether that's friends, family, or giving them information about a local resource or a hotline. Now, again, we're not telling them what to do. We're just letting them know what they can do. We're not making any decisions for them, and we're not sharing any information without their consent. Now, I want to emphasize, you do not need to be an expert. If you're already wondering, like, oh, I don't know how I would handle this situation, the most important thing that you can do and the most powerful thing that you can do is give power back to that person, and really just focus on their safety. Let them know that whatever they decide, that is entirely up to them. But you're just concerned about their safety. And when it really comes to that in the moment crisis communication and problem solving, and you have a really complicated case, just know that there are trained professionals available to you 24 hours a day. And you can work in teamwork with our Safeline advocates or with the hotline advocates with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And you can work with them. You can provide that information to the patient, or you can make that call with your patient. And I'll provide that information at the end. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the rescuing approach versus the empowering approach. And I think this is an easy trap to fall into. It's a trap that I've fallen into Because I've gone into this work, and I'm sure a lot of you have gone into this work because you really want to help people. And if you're one of those folks that's just really passionate about helping others, sometimes you can unintentionally take control of the situation and take power away from someone. And I think this is especially hard because in healthcare settings, people are used to getting instructions, they're used to getting recommendations. So we kind of need to shift our roles a little and make sure that the way we provide local resources or the way that we're providing a referral isn't unintentionally taking power away from someone. And we aren't unintentionally giving off the impression that this is something that they have to do. So the way we can rephrase that, instead of telling someone to call the Safe Line, we can just ask them, are you aware of any local resources? Have you ever heard of Safe? Would you be interested in getting a little more information about them? In that way, we're giving options, we're giving control back. The same way that we were talking about the core of violence and abuse is using power to take control away from someone. The person that we're working with has already had so much power taken away from them, so much control taken away from them. So the most powerful thing that we can do in that moment is give power back and give control back.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.